Hello, it's Mick Coyle here. Mental Health Monday will sound a little bit different this week because there's a different presenter in the hot seat. I am officially away from the studio for a week, so in my place, Dave Easson is taking on the duties of doing Mental Health Monday. So enjoy this week's show. I will be back next week, and in fact, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be speaking specifically to people who are going to share their story in the same way that Jake Mills did in episode 3. Their own battles with mental health, where they're up to in their own particular journeys, and how they are living their lives now. If you want to take part in conversations like that, drop me an email. Tell me your story. mick@radiocity.co.uk. That's mick@radiocity.co.uk. We could maybe read out your email on the show, on the podcast, or we could even invite you in as to be a special guest on the programme. mick@radiocity.co.uk. Here's this week's Mental Health Monday.
Mental Health Monday on Radio City Talk. Tackling the stigma.
Mental Health Monday. Welcome to this on Radio City Talk, where every Monday we talk a specific aspect of mental health. And today, very happy to be joined in the studio by John Halligan from the TUC. Was that what you saying?
Ex-TUC. I've finished in, I'm semi-retired now, so I'm a trainer in mental health first aid, but I worked for the TUC for 15 years until April last year.
So mental health first aid, how do you describe that, and why is that necessary, John?
Okay, well, everybody's kind of familiar with physical first aid, and we know that people who are trained to be physical first aiders offer an immediate response to somebody who's in some kind of crisis or had some kind of accident. They're not clinicians, they're not doctors or anything like that, but they can help to preserve life and assist people who might have injured themselves in some way. And mental health first aid is exactly the same thing, but for people with mental health conditions who might actually be in a crisis or have some kind of problem related to a condition that they've got. So mental health first aid is an attempt to do the same thing that physical first aiders do, but for mental health.
It's important to spot it, though, isn't it, and really see someone who needs that kind of help.
Yeah, and most people without any training may think they've got a handle on something like that, but it can be quite difficult to spot. I mean, quite a lot of what mental health first aiders do in their training is learn to be able to appreciate the changes in people when they're having a crisis, or listen to people when they're telling them things which can actually hide a condition. But, you know, because of the stigma associated with mental health, people don't talk openly about it, but they might be talking about it obliquely. So mental health first aiders are trained to kind of capture that kind of conversation.
So you might actually spot something where they're not talking about how they're feeling upstairs. It's just something that either they do or just they give away telltale signs, do they?
They could do. I mean, it depends. We're really talking, for first aid, you're talking about people having a crisis. So you might use ordinary language like they're having a bit of a wobble. They may have a pre-diagnosed condition, which they're not talking about routinely, and they're coping with it well. And then something happens, like they change their meds, or some crisis or other has happened to them, some other kind of event, and it's upset their equilibrium a bit, and you'll notice a change. They may not want to talk about exactly what's happening, but mental health first aiders are taught to be very kind of kindly and appreciative of people. So you might just say, you're doing okay, acknowledging that you've noticed something, and then hopefully open up a conversation with them.
Now, it's important to talk about this generally, isn't it? But also the fact that it does affect so many people.
Yeah. 1 in 4 people every year suffer some form of mental ill health, and 1 in 6 people at work. And if you think of the numbers involved in that, you know, it's tremendous. And those people who are suffering some form of mental distress often don't talk about it. Quite a lot of the time, they're not even diagnosed. There's loads of people, 75% of people who need help don't get any at all. So the figures are quite scandalous, really, if you want to start digging into them. But on a practical daily level, the chances are, if 1 in 4 people in any year are going to suffer some form of mental distress, you know, it's somebody we know, somebody close to us, somebody we bump into, someone we work with. So therefore, it's very easy from a basic human point of view to be able to get some skills so that you can support and help one another.
And obviously, you've been working with the TUC and with businesses, and as you say, it's to do with the people, with the person involved, isn't it? But also that does have a knock-on effect, obviously, because if your staff are stressed or suffering from some sort of mental health issue, that's going to affect your business as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the economic costs to the UK are huge. Most people focus upon absences, and absences associated with mental health cost about £7 billion a year. But there's a concept called presenteeism. I don't know if you've ever come across that.
As opposed to absenteeism.
Yeah, and most firms rightly are focusing upon absenteeism because it's an economic cost and they've got to do something about it. And trade unions rightly are involved with employers in discussing the appropriate way to manage absences and a humane way, hopefully, of doing it. But seldom do people focus upon this concept of presenteeism, which is when people are in work but they're not performing up to their optimum. And the reason for that quite often can be associated with high levels of stress, depression, anxiety, and so on. So if 1 in 6 workers are suffering depression, anxiety, or other associated, what you might call moderate mental ill health, then the chances are somewhere in your workplace there's somebody who could benefit from some support, and nobody's really capturing the economic costs associated with that. So Gary Johns at Concordia University in Canada calls it an iceberg. What we see on the surface in terms of absenteeism is dwarfed by what's under the surface. And the Centre for Mental Health suggests that it could be between 1.5 and 2 times as much money lost through presenteeism as absenteeism. So you're talking maybe 12 to 15 billion pounds lost to the economy, which is big numbers.
Big numbers, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And for managers and bosses themselves, they've got to look at this not from that, we're losing a load of money here, let's get rid of them, because unless you can spot this kind of thing, it's going to continue to happen. I'd say 1 in 4 people might be suffering from it in your workplace, so you've got to recognise it and deal with it.
Yeah, and managers have to acknowledge that they could be one of the 1 in 4.
That's true, yeah, actually.
The reality in businesses is quite often the managers are getting kicked all over the place by the economic pressures on businesses. So they're getting pressured to, get involved with all kinds of targets that are an increase on what they're used to doing, and they've got to try and get the workforce to, step up to those kind of new regimes of more pressure and so on. And managers, just like anybody else, can be as vulnerable to mental ill health as the next person. And so one of the appeals to employers is to think about themselves in that context. And we're firm advocates for training for managers. And there's an interesting statistic from Business in the Community which says that 98% of companies think mental health should be a company concern, and over 80% of them think their employees' well-being, health and well-being, particularly the mental health, should be a priority. But less than 10% of them have got a mental health policy. And 1 in 3 of them think that any employee with any form of mental ill health is going to be less reliable than other people. So we've got a long way to go to unpick all of this stuff that's going on in businesses.
Yeah, if you've got a third of bosses thinking that even if they do help them, they're not going to be good for their business in the end, that doesn't seem right, does it? Because you'd imagine if you help someone through it and they learn to rely on you, you can rely on them.
Exactly, yeah. And, people who've done these kind of things will show that there's a big improvement to performance and profitability when they've bitten the bullet and started getting involved with appropriate programmes for mental health support. I can think of companies in the Northwest who've started to reap an economic return, but more importantly, they've got people who are loyal to them and they stick with them and they're going nowhere. Those kind of people who will be essential to a business won't take a walk if they're being treated properly. And that's an important thing for people to remember as well.
So if you're maybe in work and you think someone at the next desk or in the office is suffering in some way or there's just something going on at home, what can you do personally if you're at work and it's a colleague?
Yeah, our advice to people who haven't been through a training programme for it is to learn to listen, to not judge, to not offer solutions to people, but to ask people questions like, is there someone new you can go to? Are you seeing somebody? Is there something that you can do to help yourself? Because one of the key elements of recovery from a mental health problem is self-help, along with medication for those people who need it, and along with talking therapies. Self-help is really important, and in fact the key to recovery is the degree to which a person's able to help themselves. So one of the things a layperson can do is have a conversation with somebody and remind them that they may well have the key to improving the situation they're in themselves. Not to pass judgment on them, but to say, open and honest questions like, is there something you can do? Do you need time out? Do you want to just take a break if it's possible to do that? Or I'll meet you later and we can have a chat. Just lend an open and honest hand to somebody without judging them.
And that can be tough as well, not just to ask the question, but also whoever's receiving that is, well, you kind of have to accept that there might be a problem here with myself.
Yeah. And lots of people don't know that there is something that could be helped. They may feel uneasy about something that's happening to them, not really start thinking of it in terms of any kind of clinical condition, but there are places where they can get help. There are people they can talk to, and there are organisations who'll just lend a willing ear. Increasingly these days, training around this is basically trying to get people to listen to one another. And often that can be the thing that gets a person back in equilibrium, the fact that somebody's listening to them. Quite often it's isolation, it's a feeling of helplessness and feeling alone that makes people who might have some kind of mental ill health take a wobble. And, that's the thing that we're trying to say to people in workplaces. Just be kind to one another and start listening to one another a little bit more. And once people change culture over time, so that it's, a more of a receptive environment, hopefully, and this is the great goal, people will be more likely to disclose a condition they've got. Because right now, people are just not prepared to do that. They're terrified of the consequences, telling the boss that they might have something wrong with them.
So what sort of reactions are you getting when you're going into workplaces? And are you dealing with small businesses or major corporations?
Both, yeah. It's interesting. I was prepared to acknowledge that sometimes some of the recommendations that you may make to a big firm can't be carried out in a small firm. They can't just put somebody else in your seat if you take a break, for example. You just haven't got the kind of resources and the slack for that. So I was prepared to acknowledge, that small businesses might have quite a lot more pressure on them to be able to do something concrete about this. But I was pleasantly surprised by the reception from a number of small business people who I've spoken to who want to do the best they can, and they'll go as far as they possibly can. One of the advantages, I think, for the small businesses is that it's a bit more personable, the relationships that they have with people. They tend, line managers tend to know people. They're not just faces who come and go on a shift and so on. And so they probably feel a very human desire to want to do right by that person. So the fact that they don't have the resources is often offset by the willingness of the small business firm to do something a bit more. The big corporates know they want to do something about it, and they're the ones who are going to be persuaded by the economic arguments because, the holes in their economic well-being are significant. Not that it doesn't matter to a small firm, it clearly does, but, you'll find in a smaller firm, you can often capitalise on the personal relationships that people have, and that's what you would do as a trainer. You would start to talk in those terms to people about the people who work for them.
And it is difficult to make that kind of intervention, though, isn't it? If you see someone, particularly if it is a small firm and there might be 4 or 5 people working in the office, to actually take someone aside and say, is everything okay? That's a big step for whoever you've trained as a first aider. Yeah. Well,
I mean, what you're trying to do is to get the kind of atmosphere in an organisation changed so that you're not alighting on individuals and, that people don't feel as if you're focusing on them, and then they might feel embarrassed and upset about that and think, well, hang on, why did he pick on me? That's clearly not what we would want them to do. But what we want them to do is be receptive to those kind of signals that might be available to understand that things are not right with somebody. And if you can create an atmosphere that's conducive to disclosure and for people to talk openly about this. I mean, just to give you a kind of clear example that I always use as a metaphor, really, is if you're playing football outside of work and, you play every weekend or something like that, if you break your leg, you're going to come into work with a plaster on or a boot on, and people are going to want to sign it, they're going to slap you on the back and you'll say, oh, what a lad you are, fancy doing that, blah, blah, blah. They're all going to be really kind of up about it. But if you've had some kind of mental health crisis and you come in, people are likely to kind of stay away from you. They're not going to broach the subject. It's almost like they might catch you or something. They don't want to talk about it. Or the other side of it is that they think, well, I might upset someone, if I talk about it. And so an untutored approach can be worse than one where people have had training. But what happens is that people stay away from them. Well, really the goal of mental health first aid training and of all mental health awareness in the workplace is to create a situation where mental ill health is normal. It's just like breaking your leg. If you've had a crisis, we should be in a position to talk about it. We're a long way off that. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we're there. All of the training and all of the materials and resources that we use are geared towards changing over a longer period the culture that people confront in the workplace.
But it's also important to say that actually you might not even know you've had. You call it a crisis. You think you'd know if you've had a crisis, but personally, it might just be something that you think, well, that's just the stress I'm going through. I'm dealing with it. I've got to deal with it somehow. And on the other side, people who can see it, well, you might not have to wait until they have a visible crisis. There's little things that you can point out, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And part of the education process is to talk about stress and vulnerability. So we acknowledge that stress is a real and important facet of human nature. We all need stress, and it comes from the days when there were saber-toothed tigers outside the cave, and you'd need to run or you'd need to pick up a stick and fight them off.
Fight or flight, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's where it all comes from. But the problem with stress is that if you get too much of it, you're kind of living on this kind of hyper real existence where the poisons are coming into your body and there's no outlet for them. So what we try to do with firms is to get them to think about the things that stress people and to reduce those stresses and to get people to understand their particular vulnerability to stress. Acknowledge their own resilience, because some people can take quite a lot of stress, but realise that they can be vulnerable to it just like everybody else, and have that open conversation without talking about an individual in crisis. So if you're preparing the ground when somebody does have a crisis, the chances are that they're more likely to want to talk about it. And if they see people in the fabric of the organisation who are championing these changes and these kinds of ideas, they're the kind of people who they'll go to. So hopefully we'll square the circle.
Well, what do you think about the way we're going with dealing with mental health generally as a country, maybe as even in the world, certainly in the West anyway? I mean, we're trying to talk about it here. This is where we have this strand of discussion on a Monday anyway. I think if people are maybe watching EastEnders now, there's a big mental health storyline going on there. Again, it doesn't seem quite as obvious as there was last week, a bus crash in EastEnders,
exactly.
But a lad who's going through it and cannot really cope with life. It's difficult to even get it across in drama form, isn't it?
It is, but I think that the soaps particularly seem to have done a good job in the last couple of years. I've noticed a change in the last couple of years where they're getting a little bit, I think they're talking to people who are involved in mental health. And they're obviously getting the storylines right, and they're picking the kind of characters well. And
it's got to be magnified to get the story across. So it's a little bit blown out of proportion, but still, it's the same themes, isn't it? Yeah,
that particular lad you're talking about in EastEnders. I mean, I think that's a well-drawn characterisation of somebody who's going through what he would be going through. And the same's been true in Coronation Street, and I think they've had something in Emmerdale Farm and so on, and one or two radio shows I've listened to where they've been plays have dealt with it quite well as well. And I think they're getting better about it, and I think they're an important way in which the population at large can start to have conversations about this. Because one of the major things we need to do in this country is to challenge stigma. One of the things that stops people from getting help when they need it, or even acknowledging that they might need help, is the tremendous stigma associated with mental ill health. And 1 in 10 people are feeling stigma every single day, even from family and friends. And we don't even know that we're stigmatising people half the time. So one of the things I always say on a 2-day course, the last thing I remind people of, is that if they can do one thing to advance the cause of a better approach towards mental health, is to challenge stigma. I'm not saying pick people up on everything they say and all that kind of thing, but just quietly do something like, when people talk about somebody taking their own life, can you tell me what you would say if you were talking about Eddie, his own life? What would you say normally? You'd say he committed suicide.
Yeah.
One of the things we suggest is that you stop using the word commit because of its association with crime. People commit a crime. And in fact, suicide was once illegal. So if we can stop using the word commit, and Mental Health First Aid England, which is the kind of licensing body for the registered trainers, they use the word complete. That might sound an awkward word to use, but if you can subtly get as many people as you possibly can to stop using the word commit, you're not evoking the same kind of thoughts in people's minds when they're talking about suicide as they might have done had they used the word commit, because it sounds like commit a sin or commit a crime. So,
even the word itself, well, it sounds like it is a crime, isn't it? It's like homicide or fratricide,
exactly.
whatever. It's suicide.
Is. Yeah. So I mean, it's not difficult. That thing's not a really big thing to ask people to do. They'll go through a period when they keep using the term interchangeably, and I'm no different from anybody else. Occasionally, it must come off my mouth now and again, but. I try to make sure that I use that word complete, and I try in all other aspects as well.
It brings out all sorts of different feelings, and it really quite changes the word, doesn't it? The whole feeling of...
Yeah. We should be starting to say things like, this person took their own life. And that then makes you think, well, why did they do that? If you say this person committed suicide, the chances are you're going to start thinking negatively of it. It's like at the very start of any mental health training we do, we ask people to go in groups or on their own and write down what mental health means to them. And the overwhelming majority of those people come back and start talking about mental illness. They're not talking about mental health, which we've all got. We've both got mental health. But if you say to somebody, tell me what mental health means to you, they start talking about depression, anxiety, and so on. So they're thinking negatively about it all the time. So this stigma is a really important thing. And if we can do more to challenge stigma through the ordinary language we use and through the way we think about things, and language is a key kind of driver of how we think about it, as you say, just saying commit makes you think X, Y, Z. Saying complete or some other word makes you think differently. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do.
John Halligan, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for coming in.
Brilliant.
And talking to us here on Radio City Talk. Mental Health Monday. This will be available in podcast form as well, so you'll be able to download this later today, and also you can go back and listen to the other Mental Health Mondays, and so much interesting information. And as you say, John, just about educating and changing our way. Educating always seems like, I've got to do that, I've got to listen.
Yeah,
but actually, just listening to people talking about it, that's all it is. And
we're not downloading on people. We're just saying, let's have a conversation about this, and these are the things that might be worth thinking about. If we can do no more than that, we're doing something good.
Thanks, John. John Halligan here on Radio City Talk, Mental Health Monday, and this is Liverpool Live.
Mental Health Monday on Radio City Talk. Tackling the stigma.